the room. Participants. So it takes a second, but they all.
Maybe I'll run this like a conversation with you.
Sure. Yeah, it is nice to have a couple of people just kind of at it, making it more.
Because I don't think we will, it doesn't look like.
We have 2 attendees, so the 3. And I did send out a reminder about 25 minutes ago to people, everybody who registered.
Okay. Oh, I thought it was just the 2 of us. No, they don't come in. I won't see them.
We won't see them. They'll just, we're running it as a webinar, so.
Got it. I'm sorry you said that, but so you're going to monitor chat. I'm just going to go. Okay.
Go, and then I'll interrupt, and if we can ask for feedback and stuff in the chat as we go. I'm going to see one more time if I can go live on Facebook. I don't know if I'm going to. I'm going to try it one more time just to see, and then we'll get started here. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We know it's a busy time of year and appreciate your flexibility with everything going on and having to reschedule. That is, I'm going to say, kind of on me and the derecho thing, that little storm that came through eastern Iowa. So we did need to reschedule. So I appreciate you joining us today. And Jen, for your willingness to have some flexibility to get going. Starting our school year off, thinking about student agency, and as we go transition between face-to-face to hybrid to virtual learning. And one of the things that I'm finding, we have done this webinar series. The AEAs have collaborated over the last 3 weeks to provide this webinar series to really help support our educators throughout the state thinking about this transition as you go through face-to-face, hybrid, and virtual environments. And the nice thing, the fun thing, I say fun, because I think it is kind of fun and exciting, is a lot of these things that we're talking about, we can do in any of these situations. So we might be learning about something new, but we can do it and use this, you know, in a year from now when things are back to hopefully normal, or whatever the new normal is going to be. So this has given us an opportunity to take some risks that maybe we might not have done or tried before, because we really want to try to engage kids the best we can. And as we know, all kids are a little bit different. And so thinking about our learners and the uniqueness. So I'm excited to have Jen here with us today to talk about student agency, because if any time is good for us to think about student agency, it's probably right now when we're trying to build those relationships with kids in a unique situation. So I'm going to pass it over to Jen. I will post any links on the document. This is being recorded, so we will post that later. So feel free to share this, sorry. And then the other thing, if you have any questions, feel free at the bottom, there is a Q&A field. So you can go ahead and drop your questions in the Q&A, or if you have any comments or anything you want to share, put any questions in the chat to everybody. Feel free to use the chat or the Q&A if you're joining us via Zoom. So I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Jen.
Great. Thanks, Stacy. Well, good morning, everyone. This topic came to the forefront for me and some of the people I work with when we were hearing from teachers, you know, this is going to be double and triple the amount of work to have some kids virtual, to have some kids face-to-face, or a hybrid model. And I really wanted to reassure teachers that I'm not going to tell you that your workload is going to be lighter at this time, but it certainly doesn't have to be triple the workload. And when we think about student agency and creating student learning pathways, that's one way to help a teacher think about, these are the plans and those plans will work, whether a student is virtual, you're in a hybrid model, or you're face-to-face. So let me get started by sharing my screen with you so you can see the slides for today. Oops. Oh, excuse me. Be nice if I got to the title slide. I apologize. Okay. First, if you're on Twitter, feel free to give me feedback on Twitter at Jen Sigrist, but also know that you can contact me via email, should there be something you hear today that's, something you want to follow up on, or learn more about. The center, just in case you're not familiar with the center, is a network of educators across Iowa, including higher ed partners and even business partners that are really trying to support the same type of idea, this future ready learning where students are the owners of their learning. So you're going to see the center's materials in some of the things that we use today, and I certainly will direct you to the website as it relates to our topic. By the end of our time together, and I know we just have a short time together, but I want you to be able to think of ways that you're going to be able to use a student learning pathway. And there's really two pieces in this outcome for today. So you're going to have to, learn about what student pathways are, but you're also going to have to change your thinking potentially about giving kids more ownership, different ways that you can give kids ownership of their learning. So our outcome will help you think of ways you may be able to use a student learning pathway in your instruction. So let's get started with this idea of student agency. What is it? I remember the first time I heard this phrase and I'm like, ugh. And then someone said, agents of their own learning. Imagine students as agents of their own learning. And then it really clicked. It's the idea that not only do students have the freedom to exercise choice in their learning, they also have the capacity to do it. And I will tell you, here's the first misconception alert. The first time you try to give students agency of their learning, you're gonna get some pushback like, I don't know how to do this. Why aren't you telling me what to do? So building capacity is a gradual release process. You certainly don't throw them in the deep end necessarily as a start. So a definition that we're working from talks about the capacity and also the freedom for students in their learning. Just as an aside, in the speaker notes and all the slides that you have today, I link you to the resources, and this definition happens to come from Education Reimagined. So you can learn more about student agency from their perspective. But I just really appreciate how they pulled out both of these words in their definition and wanted to highlight that for you. So when I think of describing student agency to a teacher, I love this visual because it really helps me think about how in the past, we have told a teacher that they are successful when they have carried all 25 or 30 students across that bridge on their back. You've told the teacher, good job you've carried them. You've gone back and picked up and you've put them all on your shoulders. And that's a hefty weight, especially as we start thinking about this time of virtual learning. And student agency challenges a teacher to change their mindset and say, I'm actually successful when all 25 or 30 of my students can walk across that bridge on their own, or get to the other side maybe through another mechanism entirely. I think about some of my son's approaches, and it may be swinging like Tarzan to get to the other side. But it's really this idea that as a teacher, all the things I do are so critical, but carrying them across, making sure they each do the same next step, isn't what makes me such a critical piece. What makes me so critical are my relationships, my ability to know what kids need motivated and how, and identifying misconceptions and how to avoid this pitfall, but also to help kids take their steps or encourage them in their thinking. So I really like this visual. Not only is it one part of student agency where you see the outcome is this sense of self-efficacy, where we know from Hattie's work that's really successful. It's a high impact strategy for changing student success in learning. So not only does it yield self-efficacy, but that sense of perseverance in a learner-driven model. If you look at the Gallup polls research, it talks about how before COVID, in a face-to-face environment, traditional high school, that students, while our attendance rates may be great, were really not that engaged in learning. So in our traditional mindset of the teacher carrying the student across the bridge, we've seen hundreds of thousands of students surveyed in this Gallup poll yearly, and their engagement in school isn't as strong as we thought it was. They show up, but are they really engaged? So I share this with you to start thinking about, ooh, I'm working my butt off as a teacher to carry those kids across, but is it really engaging them? And we know from the research that if a student is engaged, they're going to have learning outcomes. So I'm married to a math teacher, and you're thinking, what is this on the screen? Well, it's this idea that the research makes very clear. If student agency increases engagement, and engagement increases student learning outcomes, we see that very clearly in the research. We can also say then, increasing student agency is going to be better for kids. It's going to improve their outcomes. So if you were wondering, okay, I just need a little bit of that research, and you were wondering, like, okay, carrying them across seems to be successful, I would encourage you to think about, well, whose success is that? And really, the research is saying without their engagement, they're not as successful as we want them to be, and we're working so hard to do it. So in this slide deck, you have a variety of research links. I'm not going to spend time with them right now in our webinar, but I just wanted you to know that Jen didn't pull that randomly from thin air. Like that research is out there, and it's been out there for years. Student agency is not a new thing. It's very well documented. And you'll see some of this research going back as early as the 90s to really reiterate the point that engagement increases outcomes. And the way you increase engagement is by giving kids agency over their own learning. One of the ways you can think about student agency is to think about students setting goals, initiating actions toward those goals, revising and reflecting their actions, and all of that process throughout that really helps them internalize their sense of self-efficacy, belief, perseverance, empowerment. We've talked about all of those things. And I would argue that teachers in the past have done this very well. Teachers do this about their lesson plans, but we just don't change it to having the students do it. And it's coming from a totally caring place. No teacher does all of this work with the intent of not engaging kids. It's quite the opposite. But what we're going to talk about today is how can I change my lesson plan thinking to get students to do this work, to get them to set goals, to get them to think about, gosh, how do I need to take a next step and how am I doing? And because I like to sometimes think about my entry points into this work, I share this rubric or learning progression with you so you can see any step you take towards helping kids set goals, reflecting, and having more ownership in their learning is going to be a good step. So don't worry about trying to be in the sustaining mode, start right away with sustaining. Think about where might you be able to enter into this work with students setting their own goals, giving a chance to reflect on how did that go for me? What did I learn? What did I think about that? Or even providing choice. So we're going to talk about these three things throughout the learning plan that we discuss here later in this webinar. Oops. Excuse me. How do you do this? Well, let's first check the chat to see what questions we have before we get into maybe specific examples of how we could start doing this. Stacy, do we have anything in chat or questions?
We don't have anything in chat right now. I did put the link to the slide deck in there, and please feel free if you have questions as we go. We've got a great resource with Jen with us right now, and she'd love to make sure you're getting your needs met or questions that you might have answered as we go through. So
Perfect.
Feel free. And if you want to throw in the chat too how familiar you are with this and this concept, and if you've dabbled with any of these concepts, please go ahead and feel free to add that to the chat as well. And grade level or things you teach in your position. Jen can tailor some of the examples to meet those needs.
Yeah, thanks, Stacy. With this being recorded, I also, I wanted to move our question and answer to as much of what you need for those who are also face-to-face. So yes, feel free to do so throughout, but we're definitely going to leave lots of time at the end too, so we can really get specific for you. As those are coming in, I'll just share with you that The instructional models that you're going to see, there are two resources that I've shared with you. These are for education elements, and both of these images are linked to an infographic. So if it's got a gray background, it's for a secondary approach. If it has a background with color, it's talking about that same approach, but from an elementary perspective. And while we could spend lots of time talking about this and the different models, it could be its own class for sure. I'm going to move to one of my favorite examples in this blended learning example, to a flipped classroom. Because when we think about student learning pathways, the whole idea is that instead of this being written in a teacher lesson plan format, I'm writing it in a student-friendly format. So let me move to show that example. You got station, rotation, flexible playlists, but flipped classroom. So if you're from a secondary perspective, one of the things you might consider that will help you move from face-to-face, hybrid, or blended learning that gives kids some voice and choice, some ownership of their learning, could be a flipped classroom. You can see some examples of what that looks like. But what really is a benefit to this is it allows the teacher to do what a computer cannot. So the teacher flips their instruction and allows virtually things to happen like lecture, readings, notes, and then bring into the class, which if you're virtual could still be that synchronous time. Maybe it's a Zoom meeting I have with my teacher. Bring in what a computer can't do. And that's, okay, I'm stuck here. These are the questions I have. How do these things go together? Let's have a class discussion. The teacher could pose that question. How do these things go together, to verify that what they've heard, they've understood. In an elementary model, it could look similar to kind of that view in the secondary, where at home is your first exposure. And I could even build in some quick checks for understanding. But when we get to the class, that's where I'm making sure there's collaboration. And again, that could be virtual as well as face-to-face. It could be, oh, you guys had a big question. That's a misunderstanding that can often happen. Let me give you just in time direct instruction. Those pieces could be available. So this is all this is a how-to strategy to lay out this learning pathway that you're about to see. So the first component we needed to understand is the idea of student agency. Okay, I've got to stop thinking about me carrying them all across. How am I going to build in the instruction so students can take their own next steps? There are a variety of resources, but we focused on this one strategy. I could flip it. I could flip my instruction. So one of the ways that those kids are going to take ownership is they have to identify their own questions. What did they know and what did they learn, and where are they still confused? That's what they're going to bring back to class for my face-to-face. So there's a strategy to kind of do the how I'm going to think about this. And now we're getting ready to move into the what an actual learning pathway looks like. Before we do, I wanted to throw this resource in as well, because blendedlearning.org also gives you example, and they have videos of what classrooms look like, but just different ways that you can think about the how you might deliver this. Okay, let's move into the what. What does this learning pathway look like? Again, this learner agency, you're going to see lots of things on the center's website that will really highlight examples. I love these graphics that Barbara Bray did with Sylvia Duckworth. And this one in particular is going to be kind of that basis of a learning pathway. It's the idea that we're moving away from a student just being a participant to a student being a co-designer, maybe the designer, maybe they're really starting to advocate for themselves, really moving it to a different part of the continuum where they're driving their learning. So what's a step we can take? Well, let's start with a learning pathway that the teacher may start creating. Over time, you may find that a learner can start creating it. But we're going to start with this notion that we're just entering into this work. So here could be one example. This is actually a learning pathway that I put together for a course that I'm teaching. And it deals with a very similar learning outcome for today's session. So I thought, okay, for this webinar, I'm going to use the one I put together for my own course. I'm teaching this. So you can see that the learning pathway starts with a driving question. It lists essential learning outcomes, and it doesn't, I mean, this research has been around for so long. Writing your learning targets is good for second language learners. It's good for students who have individual education plans. It's also good for all kids. So laying out there the target for learning, Hattie talks about this in his research. It's an assessment practice. I mean, just so important for kids to know, what is it you want me to learn? So that's where the learning pathway starts. Let's go deeper into this example so you can see what it might look like. So for you today, this is your driving question. I wanted you to be able to think about how you can use student learning pathways to transition between any learning model. Well, we don't have a whole week, so we're not going to be able to get this all done, but you can imagine what, if we had a week together, what it might look like. There are learning targets. We have one vocabulary piece that we really want to make sure we're consistent on, and that's student agency. I put an example that we're going to see in just a moment of what success looks like throughout this. The rubric we're working towards is creating a learning pathway. I have a variety of resources that you can use to learn about it. And again, this is our full course. So today I'm just scratching the surface on what this could look like. But you can see examples, and you can spend as much time as you want with examples. I can even say which ones are required or which ones are optional if I want. So these are our resources to learn about it. Then we have, what are the activities that are going to be helping me practice it, to really engage in the learning. And this is where embedding technology as a tool is really helpful for the teacher. So I've used some different examples between a learning journal, a Flipgrid, but really it's about showing your understanding. That's the way to practice it. These are not graded, this is feedback. How do I help make sure that the learner's on the right pathway? And what's so great about having tech tools embedded is that it gives them immediate feedback without waiting on me all the time as the teacher to give even more detailed feedback. So a learning pathway starts with making the learning goals clear for the learner. The learning goals are clear. The learning pathway also lays out how the learner can learn about it. And it gives them chances to practice and give feedback so they know they're on the right track. Finally, it's about the evidence of learning. What is it that I have to show, and how do I get to show what I know, so that I can really make sure I've hit the learning targets? So the evidence of learning is where it all comes together. In this slide deck, we've got lots of opportunities to look at other pieces, but you're going to see that what's common to any of them, regardless of the format you choose, is student agency, is the learning pathways laid out. And in fact, I even have a couple more examples. The authentic assessment is available. You can see it. It helps kids say that they're on the right track. The grade level content is there. So I'm not remediating, I'm focusing on grade level skills and then building scaffolds for any unfinished instruction. And I see technology as a tool, not only that the teacher's using it, but students use it as well. For our short webinar today, focusing on student agency and the learning pathway is really where we're at for our learning target. Because remember, we want you by the end of this webinar to feel like I've got some ideas of how I could use a student learning pathway.
Jen, what I love about this, sorry,
yeah.
As you're talking and my brain is thinking about like all this, the districts that we serve and the buildings that we serve as an AEA person, and everybody's kind of at a different point, but if my student has their plan and they know the outcomes, they could be pretty independent and go through those. And so if we flux from a face-to-face brick and mortar back to maybe a hybrid approach, so if they're whether they're with me or not, if they know those step by step and it's clearly defined, they could do that at their own pace, and it isn't necessarily more planning. I don't need to plan something additional. This is what we're doing, and you're going to do it whether you're at home or whether or not you're at school, and I'm going to check in with you face to face or maybe even virtual. So that excites me.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like a lot more work.
Right. Thanks for bringing that up, Stacy, because that's so true. When we think about a learning pathway, the teacher can deliver that pathway face to face, even in a pretty traditional way. If your face-to-face instruction is something that you want to, really lead students through, the learning pathway is still appropriate. And if you have students simultaneously that are online, they can use the learning pathway. So you can embed, recorded lesson examples. You can build in those, formative assessment pieces that you may deliver face-to-face using the same tech tool that kids from the online learning are able to use. Or maybe you're using a quick write and kids in class are writing on paper, but your kids in the virtual learning environment, they're submitting it through a Google Doc or a chat, or you've got all sorts of ways, but the pathway doesn't change. So that's the advantage really to laying those out. Thanks for highlighting that. You are spot on. Let's look at some more examples. So a learning pathway can take any format, right? Any format. The format is what works best for you. It doesn't have to be, a specific template. In this slide deck, you do have a template on that last screen. I did link a template for you to make a copy of, and there are guiding questions in there, should you want to. But I wanted to highlight that that's not the only way. All that you need in a student learning pathway is very clear learning goals and a way for students to follow through the learning journey. So if the journey is a secret to students, it's not a pathway. If it's only clear to the teacher, that's not a pathway. The intent is to make all your lesson planning, all the work that teachers are so good at doing, it's making it visible to the student in student-friendly language and ways. So I thought I'd put together some examples for you. So one is a Google Classroom. So here's an example of the course I talked about earlier. Should you be interested in the same topic and exploring it deeper, you can earn a license renewal credit. And the way it's laid out is linearly, but it's got an introduction, and it tells people where they can go get help. It lays out the learning goals. You see in this game board example, here's the driving question. What does this mean? And then they can see, oh, this is what I do first. And I move around the learning board. So that's a visual way to move through that. This example was a team. This is a 4th grade example where the team put together this, and the student had one place to go for all of their content areas. So teachers would put in different resources, not one teacher being responsible for the whole thing. So a great way to use your PLC as a team to say, how can we work together and create learning pathways for students? And I saw another example was Google Slides, and the teacher just changed the background color to help students see how they would move through. And the learning targets would be on each slide, so they knew, oh, when I work through this, I'm going for this big idea. So you've got all sorts of examples that you can look at. I've highlighted just a few here, but remember, it's not about the tool, it's not about the format. It's about the learning journey laid out for the student to follow, and as independently as possible. Save your teacher expertise for the things that a computer cannot do. Save your expertise as a teacher, not for, let me lecture, let me tell you, but instead save it for, let me help you uncover. Let's get a collaborative group together. Let me pose questions to see if you really understand this. Let me help identify a misconception for you. Let me get you back on the right track. Those are things that a computer can't do, and are so critical about a teacher that we really want to highlight that. And that works in face-to-face as well as it works virtually. So when I say, save your teacher time, if you're in a virtual environment, that could be through a Zoom. It could be that synchronous digital way we're connecting. If it's face-to-face, it could be that obviously synchronous, but classroom conversation. So these things can work even if we're virtual, and you've got that laid out in the pathway for you all along the way. So finally, I think the biggest way to engage in this work is think about what might be the first place to start, and what might be your questions when you're thinking about getting kids to have more ownership in their learning. What might be a starting point? Let me give you a moment to think about that and start generating questions about your starting point, or share your idea about where you're thinking about starting, to give a linear view of learning for students. While you're doing that, I'm going to pull up the template as an example, just so you can start to see what it might look like. So start generating those questions in chat. I'll bring up a learning pathway template, and we can consider questions to address as we move forward. While you're thinking about those, a reminder, the format can be anything. The format can be a Google slide, a Google Doc. It can be a template, a PDF that you've moved into something more fillable, but they all have these same pieces. What's my hook? What do I want kids to know, and how do I make that student friendly? And what does success look like? Lay that out right up front. Then where are they going to have choices in the Learn About It? And how can I utilize technology, maybe some videos that are already created for the Learn About It? Practice it, gives them feedback along the way. That authentic assessment piece not only includes feedback, but then the evidence of learning. I'm reading some things in chat here.
Great.
I appreciate this comment about launching into this learning and giving kids experience with executive functioning skills, like the hidden rules behind this. I totally appreciate that comment, and I'm going to go back to this piece about student agency being not only the freedom, but the capacity. When I think of a gradual release of instruction, that includes student agency. So the student learning pathway you could lay out, but you're going to have to walk them through that. How do I look at a learning target and ask myself as a learner, do I know this? Am I on the right track? Self-reflection is not something kids automatically know how to do. And I appreciate that this resource here really highlights reflection. So as a teacher, okay, how do I get them to move beyond just the process of reflection to start tracking their own data and really reflecting on it, how they might monitor and build that in. So I absolutely appreciate that comment about building in the routines and the practice of student agency as well. We don't tell kids, just get to the other side of the bridge, figure it out. Like, we have to help them with that. And in my experience, the students who often struggle with this the most are the I play school well, I get good grades, I do whatever the teacher tells me kinds of students. And they say, why aren't you telling me what to do? And as a teacher, that's really hard to say, I'm not going to tell you what to do. What do you think your next steps are when you see these resources? Building in that coaching.
Well, I'm wondering too, Jen, as you go through that template and you think about moving from participant to entrepreneur, um, could I could see start of the year, I have that template filled out for my students, but maybe as we hit mid-year, I fill in some of those chunks. I have the I can statements, but hey, I go back to kind of that learning pit um, analogy and thinking about how do kids know how to get themselves out of the pit. So where do we go to seek the answers so they could start filling out, how do I demonstrate? What are the tools you already have developed this year to demonstrate your learning and show what does success look like in this situation? So have you done that with kids? Have them help develop and fill that template out as even as a class, define some of those?
You know, most of the time when I've done a learning pathway, the part that I have students fill out are the learn about it, practice it.
Okay.
Often, and I might be more in the, when I say this, the developing, advancing. This isn't maybe a sustaining practice, or I'll use this. It might be more of the teacher learner centered piece here, not fully learner driven. When I say to you, I'll have students, learners, let me go to the full view of it up here, excuse me. I'll have learners, oh, I need to look at the right tab, fill out some of the learn about it pieces with me.
Yeah.
I may say, okay, here are the I can statements. Those are really non-negotiable. The evidence of learning, non-negotiable. I want everyone to be able to do this, but let's talk about this piece together. Here I think is a good resource. You guys look into it more. Give me some examples. Let's increase the examples here. If you found something that was really helpful for you, let's link it back to our whole class in this learn about it section. And we can say, I mean, imagine how powerful would this be? 2 resources by the teacher, and then look at all the resources that your classmates put on as optional things for you to consider. And imagine if Susie put a note, this really helped me because of this, or Bobby said, this graphic really made sense to me. Imagine that collective understanding that grows. And then the practice it phase, we've talked about that as well. Okay, you guys, how can I help you know that you're on the right track? Sometimes it could be, that was really helpful last time. Could you build something like that in? Or I really like that small group. Let's have a small group where my 5 teammates, you know, we talk about it first. Okay, that could be in the practice it, you bet. So those types of things are probably more of the examples I can relate to personally. Of course, I've seen examples where students are, I mean, the far end of the continuum, when you have a lot of openness, a lot of flexibility in how you go about learning, including the time frame. You can have a student even present the driving question. You know, they're creating this is what I want to learn about. And then the teacher says, okay, well, here's how it relates to the standards. What are you going to do? You present the project to me. What are you going to create? And that's really that far end of the continuum of student agency, being able to create that, for sure.
So I think one of the questions I'm looking at, Christine in the chat just had an I can statement. I can ask questions about what I read, and then, or how can I better understand what I read by asking questions about what I read? And that, my 4th grade teacher hat, like, is starting to play out this with that, and so is my middle school teacher hat, like all learners, and even as an adult, yeah, how can I stop and ask questions and be cognizant? So.
Right. And I love this part that as a high school teacher, you know, we sometimes think kids already know something, like, oh, they should already know how to send emails. Yet Kelly put in chat that idea of teaching kids how to, you know, phrase an email to an adult to get that help that they need. That's a skill you have to teach. We make some assumptions, and it's like, no, we know that's part of students being agents of their own learning. And as a teacher, when you get that email that maybe is curt or isn't very clear or doesn't help you help the student, using that as a teaching moment. Okay, this is just as much about being able to write a correct email, you know, in a way that gets you the information that you need, as it is for, you know, adults to be able to do that, but even the content that we're trying to get across. I appreciate too the idea that this learning pathway isn't something that a classroom teacher has to create on their own. Special education teachers, teachers who might be familiar, like your counselor with social emotional learning competencies. If you're not, as familiar with that yet, those would be great resources to bring in to this idea of creating a student learning pathway. Because your big idea for learning may be about the content, but you may find learning targets specific to those competencies or executive functioning skills, as we've talked about earlier, those things like I can set out a timeline for myself. You may have to build in. We talked about nice to haves here, maybe things like office hours. You could include nice to haves like, how long should this take me? How am I going to build out a timeline for myself? Well, what are you going to do today? I mean, you could really expand this in any way that you want. And I appreciate the examples that I was able to pull from various teachers, that they're not going to be perfect, but they were perfect for them at the time, because they might have added things or took things off that were meaningful for their context. But overall, we're still talking about the same kind of learning goals, where it's written in student language so that they can follow it. That's probably my biggest message today. If you're a teacher hearing this, free yourself from the idea that you have to know all the plans. You have to prepare those. It's all on you to carry all 30 kids across the bridge. Or if you're a secondary teacher, all 155 kids across the bridge in my content area. Change that to, how will I lay this out for students so that students are on that journey, and I can guarantee that they're all going to get across, however they're going to do it, but they're going to get across. They're going to have what they need to get across. And that's the big shift in our thinking. We've been applauded as teachers for carrying kids across the bridge. And I would encourage you to applaud yourself when all kids get across, and can do so with a little less carrying and a little more independence. And that's hard. It's hard for my own kids to see them. I don't like to see them struggle sometimes, like, oh gosh, but gosh, so much great learning happens. And sometimes it's that social emotional learning piece or the executive functioning skills that really benefit, really get practiced in those times of struggle, when, we're letting kids kind of take their reflection and their goal setting, their action steps in the process. There's, that phrase, you can't become independent without practicing it. So it's hard to do. It's hard to do, to let that feeling go and shift our minds to say, they're going to practice independence, and that's success too, when they can be independent.
And I think calling that out and having that open conversation with students, age, grade level appropriate, right? But letting them know, because as adults, we struggle. I think a lot of our teachers right now are struggling a little bit, and they're taking risks, but they're having success because of it. And building their toolbox, similar to what kids will do with the pathway. They're going to keep adding tools to their toolbox to help them cross that bridge.
Yeah. Stacy, I appreciate that you said grade level appropriate, because it makes me think, as a trained secondary teacher, but I was also an elementary principal, I would sometimes in my secondary hat be thinking like, oh gosh, these kids, they can't get this part, and then I go down and see 6 and 7-year-olds being able to do it. I'm like, oh, it's not the kids. It's me. I didn't set it up right. I didn't build those routines. They can do it. They absolutely can do it. And sometimes you'd want to take your 15-year-olds down to that kindergarten and first grade room, like, look at how independent they are. You can do it too. But an advantage I was able to have in a K-12 building and district. But certainly, if you're a secondary teacher hearing this, hear the message just as much as if you're a kindergarten or first grade teacher. Students are going to need help building the capacity. They'll love the idea of the freedom, but they have to have the capacity as well, to be able to take ownership. So what are steps you can walk them through? Baby steps, gradual steps for yourself as the teacher, but for your students too, to think about that agency.
Looking at the chat, thanks, Jen, so much for being with us today and taking the time to share. And I will post the recording. I know it's kind of hard to talk at a screen and have people there and not get some reaction. So thank you, thank you, thank you. If you could give, just to end, as teachers are starting to prepare for this year and tackle something, maybe this is new to them, what would the one piece of advice that you would leave them with?
Oh, one piece of advice. I would make it clear to students what it is you want them to learn. Learning targets are the first step, the most critical step, the biggest bang for your buck, however you want to phrase it. Just like trying to say to you today in the webinar, I just wanted to have you with ideas of how you might be able to use this. In 30, 45 minutes, I thought that's probably all we'd be able to accomplish. Just like setting that out to a student, that's an important part of learning. I need to know what I need to pay attention to. And then if you set that out, I can also say along the way, I'm not there, I'm not getting it. It helps them ask questions. So that would be my first advice. The second one, I would just say, give yourself grace. You're gonna be better at this in September than you were right now. And you're gonna be better in April than you are in September. This idea of a student learning pathway and really bringing in agency is perfect timing, but it doesn't mean we've had lots of experience doing it yet. So we're going to be much better in April than we are right now. But just like kids learn with a little bit of productive struggle, so do we as adults. So set those learning criteria or those learning targets out there. Give yourself some grace as your students and you are both working toward them. And that's the beauty of our profession. We get better every year.
Mm-hmm. Great. All right. Well, I'm going to pull up one last slide to show you all just where you can find the recordings to this webinar and others on this bit.ly. And I will do a follow-up email if I can remember how to share my screen, because heaven forbid I've done this before. Here we go. So all of the recordings can be found at this bit.ly, AEA webinar series. And again, all participants, I will email that out. Recordings and resources will be here for you. Have a wonderful year. If you have questions about this or any of the topics covered in our webinar series, feel free to reach out to your local AEA, and there are supports at each AEA that can help you. I just saw something in the chat. I'm going to stop my screen share. Let's see if I have anything more in the chat. All right. Christine said, excellent session. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone who has joined us for all your hard work. Best of luck this year. We're going to do a lot of great learning and just continue, like Jen said, to get better every year. All right. Have a great day.
Thanks, Stacy. Thanks, everyone.